a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hi, and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History podcast. And I'm here as ever with my good friend Gary Bain, and it's a pleasure to be at your house again, Gary.
Hi Pete, how are you?
I'm very, very well, and I was just thinking as I walked here, it must be great as a football fan, because all the time as I was walking from sunny East Finchley, you could see this massive cathedral of football before me, and I know it must be great for you to be nestling here under White Hart Lane, the mighty new stadium to the wonderful Tottenham Hotspur.
Yeah, the only problem is I support Arsenal, Peter.
Oh dear. Why do you live here? Oh, never mind. Something to do with Janet?
Something to do with Janet.
And the other thing is, I'd like to say thank you to Janet for the coffee, for the welcome, and also, of course, to the unusual welcome afforded me by your dog Fred, which, I'm sure the stains will come off my leg, but does he often do that? Because he's a bit old for it.
Yeah, he was just being friendly, Peter.
Well, he's a lovely old boy. It's good to see some spirit in him, and spirit all over me. Anyway, to move on, what are we doing today? Because we're not here to talk rubbish and vaguely insult each other. We're here to talk about the South Notts Hussars, the 107th Regiment, Royal Horse Artillery, and take it through the next. That was a bit of a mispronunciation there, wasn't there? And take it through the next step, which is their deployment to Palestine. In previous episodes, which you can listen to, we have covered their recruitment before the war and their early training, summer camp, things like that. And then we discussed their deployment in England on mobilisation, looked at their time in Yorkshire, and I understand that I have to apologise to all Yorkshire people for certain remarks, all made in jest, of course. No one could possibly be rude about Yorkshire people.
It wasn't just Yorkshire, Peter. It was Derby and Cooks and anybody else.
Well, these things happen at sea. If you want to hear our Jutland podcast, that's also available. Anyway, we're now looking at when they go off to war. Or actually, they're not going off to war, are they, Gary? Because where they're sent to is Palestine. And at this stage, we're at war on the Western Front in France and Belgium with Germany, but we're not at war with Italy. Italy doesn't come into the war until June of 1940. So for 6 months, they're going to basically a peacetime deployment. Their job is to replace regular soldiers, regular units. And the 1st Cavalry Division, and at this stage they still did have horses, and we were going, the South Notts rather, were going as the artillery, the Royal Horse Artillery for that Cavalry Division.
So just to rewind slightly, Peter, where did they leave from and where did they go to? Did they go straight from England out to Palestine?
They set off in January, and it's always great fun when an army unit goes abroad. For the ordinary soldier, there's not much. That's just the basic kit that they always have. But the officers had an awful lot of stuff to take with them, because it's a different life for officers, and it's important that people realise that at this stage of the war. So they've got everything a young officer could need. So they've got sports kit, they've got their mess kit, they've got civilian clothes in case they should be invited to a posh soiree by the local governor or whatever. They've got everything with them. They really are. They've got everything. And they go off to where they go on the trains. And we discussed this earlier, the importance of trains to mobilising units. That was in the last podcast. And they went to Southampton, where they boarded the Maid of Orleans, bound for far-off France. And
France?
Yes, they're on the way. It's they don't just sail there; they go to France first. And I think this is a lovely quote I'm going to read from a gunner, Ted Holmes. Ted Holmes was one of the nicest people I ever interviewed. He in later life, a grave digger. Fantastic. He told me all about it. Great job. If you think you've got that grave for life, you haven't. Anyway, he said,
even.
But Chesterfield is right, as is Nottingham. They're right in the middle of the country, and people didn't poor working class people often didn't get about much. And Ted told me this. He said, Southampton to me only existed on a map. It's not until you get down there and actually see it that you realise. You see Southampton docks, all the ships, and realise what the sea's like. He'd never seen the sea before. I thought it was marvellous. It was still like a big adventure to me. And you know, they're going off and they're lads going to, it's experiences they've never had. You know, they've never, you know, and the fact that these experiences wouldn't quite turn out great, you know. And another quote from a gunner, Ernie Harry, I think he was a Nottingham lad, can't quite remember, but he was a cracking chap. And he said, I walked up the gangplank and honestly thought I'd never see the shores of England again. I don't know why. I was depressed, very depressed. When we were with one another, we never showed any signs of depression or anything. We were always laughing and jovial wherever we went. You kept your thoughts to yourself. And this is, you know, it's, you can imagine everybody is feeling the same, worried, nervous, leaving their family, don't know. We mentioned in the last podcast about the South Notts, that their wives were probably, and girlfriends, more likely girlfriends at that age, but they were in more danger, in a sense, from air raids than they were going to Palestine, which was an area not at war. So, you know, it's a strange situation. You're going off to war, but actually it's the people back home who are in the war at that time. So they go off and they go into Cherbourg in France, and you know what? The next bit just it reminds me of when you and I have been on the odd jaunts to foreign parts. It's just never seems to change the British character. And guess what they did, Gary?
Well, I should imagine they sampled some of the local opportunities, shall we say? Yes,
opportunity. And most of them left it at the beer. Or rather, did they? And this is Gunner Fred Brooks. Now, he was unwise in his choice of drink. Gary. Who's Barry?
Who's Barry?
Yeah.
Oh, Jeff,
Who is
Jeff
this?
will love you for calling me Barry.
Yes, Jeff does call you Barry. But who's Jeff? Anyway, this is his quote. I remember getting absolutely blind drunk because my mates. Yeah. My mate recommended what we should drink. He said we ought to drink red wine and kirsch.
Oh.
Is that some dim and distant memory it's calling back there? We got in at Estaminet and stayed there. I got back to this train and I remember sitting on this metal step and I heaved my bloody heart out. I really did. It tasted worse when it came back, I'll tell you. And this is just classic. You know, you're all used to Chesterfield and Nottingham ales are very weak, 3.4, 3.6, really weak. People are used to quaffing ales, 8 pints and then down the pit next day or into the office, you know. But you drink red wine and kirsch and you're going nowhere. It's fond memories, eh, Gary?
Oh, absolutely.
Have you drunk kirsch?
No, I've drunk red wine.
Just a sip or two, I expect.
Yeah, just to be social.
Now, there are also, of course, the other temptations, which you rather indelicately alluded to in the sense that opportunities.
Yeah.
Well, most of the men were barely aware of such opportunities. Again, Gunner Ernie Harry, and it wasn't a great name, Harry, but he was a lovely bloke. And he said, when we got back on the train, we got all talking and exchanging stories of where we went. One said, did you get in such and such a place? I said, I think we walked in and walked out. He said, did that girl come up to you, making a fuss of you? I said, she did. Why? He said, that was a brothel. Ooh, I said, I've never ever seen one of them before. I always wanted to see what it was like. Aye, and she was after taking you upstairs. I missed my chance then. Of course, they pulled my leg and said, you must have been dumb. I said, I must have been. But of course, many of these people were 18, 19. They didn't know what, you know, they'd stirred their tea with it for most of their lives. You know, that's about all they got round to. And, you know, brothels were a bit strange. Some of them would change radically as the war went on. As he alluded to, they got on a train and went down to Marseille. And that journey was a journey to... Yes, I don't know why, Gary. It's the British Army.
Sorry, I am looking a bit confused here.
Yeah.
So let's just recap. So they've left Southampton, gone to Cherbourg, and then now on a train to Marseille.
That's it. You listen more than people think.
Yeah.
And on the train, it was hell. Because you've got to remember, it was January, no heating. The only heating was that the men, not the officers, the men were packed like sardines with all their kit bags jammed in, and a lot of them got a sort of, well, it's very topical at the moment with the current development, coronavirus. They all got this sort of influenza-y, coldy thing. And one of them, Ray Ellis, made a great remark. He got really badly, and he made the remark, I thought I might come back on a stretcher. I didn't expect to go on the boat to war on a stretcher. He was stretchered onto the troop ship. And the troop ship they went on to was HMT, Her Majesty's Troop Ship Devonshire, which was a sort of passenger liner thingy, troop shipy thing. A lot of them struggled on the voyage because it was rough. Well, why would that be in January? But yeah, it was rough. And a lot had never been to sea before. They were inexperienced, and they soon experienced the joys of vomiting for another reason. So the vomiting seems to be playing a large part of this. Anyway, they got to Haifa in Palestine on the 29th of January 1940. And it didn't start well because they had an outbreak of meningitis on the ship. Now, meningitis can kill you,
So were they quarantined on arrival?
Yes, they were. Again, that's very topical at the moment with coronavirus. Let's hoping when this is broadcasted, it's all gone away and we all lived happily ever after. But I suspect not. Anyway, they were quarantined at a half-completed camp at Sarafan for a couple of weeks in tents. Here's just it's one of those apocryphal stories, but you'll recognise it from your own distinguished service career. Ernie Hurry again, he said, I remember the very first night. A friend of mine, Nobby Noble, British nicknames are fantastic. Nobby Noble, he wanted to go to the toilet. He picks up Bill's boot. He used his boot. So when Bill put his boot on next morning, he says, my word, they have a heavy dew out here, don't they? And emptied his boot. We never stopped laughing. He never knew. Well, he must have been thick. No sense of smell, but there you go. Now, the guns and equipment were coming out on another boat, and that was delayed. Strange, that. I can't think why that would be. So for a while, they're just doing foot drill, marching up and down, route marching, basically. Dum, 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 that kind of thing. And the men got pretty bored, so... mid-February, so after...
Can I just take you back, Peter? When we last spoke in the previous podcast, they'd been issued Great War 18-pounders. So the guns that they were waiting for, were they now the upgraded, state-of-the-art modern guns?
No, they weren't. No, the 425 battery, when they eventually arrived in about March, they got Mark II 18-pounders, which had rubber tyres fitted. So big step forward. While 426 battery got the 4.5 howitzers. So these are both straight First World War guns, the field artillery of the First World War. One thing that was better, in mid-February, just before that, they go to a new camp at Gadira in central Palestine. I don't know where it is. I see a note to myself. Why do historians do this? It says 8 miles south of Rehovot. I don't know where Rehovot is. I mean, why do we feel the need to pretend we know things when we don't, Gary?
I think suffice to say they moved from the coast inland, don't they?
We'll go for that, shall we? Yeah. So they moved inland, yeah.
One of the questions I've got is in England, we made great play of how atrocious the food was. So presumably they've arrived in these tented camps. What was the food and accommodation like? Well,
by this time, we talked a bit about Sergeant Ted Hayward.
Yes.
He'd now become a sergeant, having been promised it and then made a gunner. By this time, he was a sergeant. And he'd begun to get a grip on his vocation, and his influence was spreading. Now, once they got the tents erected at Gadira, they all had to put them up themselves, so I can imagine there was some laughter and fun doing that. They did get better, and appertaining to this is one of the greatest oral history quotes I've ever heard in my entire life. I had to actually stop the recording because I was laughing. Ray Ellis, who was always one of my favourites, wonderful bloke. He was a school teacher late in life, a headmaster. And he looked stiff, but he had a delightful sense of humour. And this, I fear, features swearing, Gary. Now, I want you to close your ears towards the end of it. And it's just a great story. And he says this: the food, Ray Ellis said, the food definitely improved in Palestine. The conditions we ate under were better. We had a better mess tent. And we sat at trestle tables. The presentation was better. If a soup or stew type of meal was being served, it was served in a more civilised manner. It wasn't scooped up by some dirty man and dropped on a cold plate. It was still a bit rough, but much improved. We used to say, and this is the great bit, we have a fantastic cook in the troop at the moment. He's a classical scholar. Oh, yes. Yes, really. In fact, he has a Latin motto. Fuck 'em, give 'em stew. It's just so brilliantly, and if you have, it's just brilliant. Fuck 'em, give 'em stew, and it's just so in line with the attitude of cooks in the army ever then and ever since. Brilliant. But it was getting better. It was getting better, and as usual, the lads are doing their usual sport. I want you to picture British Army, so you can take it for granted. They're playing football, they're running, they're doing all the rest of it. But one thing is that Palestine was an unusual country for them. It was a foreign country, very different, wasn't it?
Yeah, so did they have any understanding of the Arab and Jewish problems? You only just had the Arab Revolt, 1936-39, and I believe there were some Jewish insurrections at the time as well.
Well, there was problems within the Jewish community. If you like, well, problems. There was unrest. I think it's. I've always had been a great believer that the British and French are entirely responsible for most things that happen in the Middle East in the First World War. I don't think we ever understand what's going on there. I don't now, and I'm sure people didn't then. There's some interesting quotes from people. I mean, there's. And it shows the difficulty of the situation. One of the lads, it was Ray Ellis, in fact, he saw some Palestine police who are British police serving in Palestine, beating up with big sticks some Jewish ladies, and he sort of remonstrated with them. What are you doing? They're girls. He said, yeah, one of those girls put the eye out of one of my mates. It's difficult. It's a difficult situation for people to comment on. And at the time, I'll be honest with you, the lads kept out of it. They weren't involved in putting down any insurrections. There was no trouble with the Arabs. They were vaguely aware that elements of the Jewish population were upset. And that's about as far as it went for the lads.
And presumably that's why the officers decided, got no guns, can't do anything else. So the sport became really important. Get them focused on something. And
you don't want them rambling around in the towns when they could be attacked by, I suppose, Arabs still or Jewish population. So you wanted it. And one of the great things that was a sports day the 1st Cavalry Division had. And the stories always seem to centre on the boxing. Now, you were a boxer. We've discussed this before. You were a super welter bantamweight sausage fighter. Put on a spot of weight now since then, but still in good shape. Obviously, I'm looking at you now, and you'd still make super heavyweight without the slightest difficulty. And some of the lads, there were rules. If you'd been a professional boxer, you couldn't take part in the boxing competition. And we had this bloke, Tommy Foley, and he'd been a good boxer. I mean, I think it's exaggerated how good he was. They reckon he was a champion. But he wasn't allowed to take part by the rules, so they didn't put him in. The other regiments, according to the South Notts Hussars, had all these pros fighting. And a couple of the lads I interviewed, Harold Thompson and Frank Knowles, they went in. And Harold Thompson sums up what happened, because they were wearing... They were in shit order, sort of plimsolls shorts, And he says this, Frank was first, that's Frank Knowles. And, he got caught. His face and eyes were cut, blood all over the place. My turn. And this youth came in with boxing shorts, proper boxing shorts, shoes, gum shields. It got everything. I thought, aye, he's not going to hurt me. I went straight across and hit him. Woof! He sort of shook his head and then he got going. He hit me on top of the head. I thought, I better go down. I went down. Then I realised he hadn't hit me hard enough. In other words, he didn't have the excuse to pretend to be unconscious. I lasted 3 rounds, but he hardly laid a glove on me because I was getting out of the road all the time. I'm just doing running motions here. Probably the mic will come off again. If I'd have won... This is the classic soldier. If I'd have won, I'd got to fight the bloke that Frank had lost to. And I wasn't wearing that. I just love it. It's fantastic. Serviceman. Brilliant. There were very few victories for the South Notts Hussars that day, End of March, they moved to Hadera. This is where they got the guns, and they all start on gun drill. We talked about that before. So listen to previous podcasts. So they're all learning every role in case they get wounded. So they'd have the gun layer, they'd have the gun sergeant, they'd have the loader and the gun numbers, all practicing, going round. The specialists were doing their stuff. They were also practicing driving in desert conditions, dropping the guns into actions. So driving along then as quick as possible, dropping the guns into action positions and sort of getting a round off or pretending to get a round, setting up telephone lines from the OP observation post to the command post so they could pass down ranges when they're in action. They're doing all this, and they were inspected on the 15th of April in the middle of this by Wavell, and there's the other, and it's General Archibald Wavell, and this is a classic. You remember Spike Milligan, my part in he has a very similar story. Ray Ellis is in the line when Archibald Wavell comes back. He's known as Archie to his friends. He walked along the line as generals do and picked up some odd man to speak to. He stopped in front of me and said, "Do you feel ready to go out and meet the enemy?" To which I replied, "Yes, sir." "Good man," he said, and walked on. I think that had Hitler known I was ready to go and meet the enemy, the Third Reich would have trembled. Which is very,
very Spike Milligan.
Very Spike Milligan. In fact, that's why I think when you listen to oral history and personal experience, if anything's too perfect, it's not necessarily untrue because people had that sense of humour. But you've got to always just bear in mind it's perhaps a story rather than something that really happened.
Now, for the benefit of our mutual friend Dudders, I'm going to ask something that perhaps is a bit in your own, but it's hot.
That is Dudders.
It's hot.
Do you mean Colonel Dudley Giles?
Yes, I do. It's very hot. What about sunburn? What sort of thing did they do to protect themselves?
Well, the British Army has a splendid method of protecting you from sunburn. It's a charge.
Yeah.
So you can get it. They couldn't give a damn if you get it, but if you get it, you'll be on a charge. I do love one thing. Harry Day was the medical orderly, and he went to the beach, and he was a fair-skinned lad. Fell asleep on the beach, and he was the first to go down with sunburn. He was the medical order responsible for treating it. And this is just the British Army. If there's sun, they'll get sunburnt. But if you can't do your duty, it's a charge. There's no interest in factor 47 million sun cream lotion and the rest of it. Just don't do it. Cover up or be on a charge. But there are other things that they were worried about. Can you guess what that might be in a foreign country?
Well, I'm going back to my opportunities comment, really. So I presume there was some sexually transmitted diseases, as well as other less dramatic infections.
Yeah. I mean, the British Army, they're always keeping an eye on things like scabies. We talked about that kind of thing last time. But the VD is it's an ever-present thing. It's not particularly wrong in that sense. It's just what happens. But I do love, this is Harry Day again, a medical order. I do love the contrasting treatments that people put forward. I'll read the quote from Harry. Gonorrhea was the thing. Lectures were given on the women and brothels. The adjutant, Major Batt, suggested that a man should work off his surplus energy by indulging in sport and as much physical hard work as he could. The doctor, Captain Finnegan, advised that the men should carry and use a condom and then the prophylactic centres afterwards. Now, which do you think was the most effective, Gary?
Well, I think sport, clearly.
Yeah, obs. That's the way we'd go, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. For some reason, I couldn't think of the word gonorrhea when I was trying to think of sexually transmitted disease. So
Well,
thank you for that.
Yeah,
It's an age thing, I think.
I think so. So they're carrying on, and then in May they're getting ready for. Still no war with Italy. They're getting ready though, and they moved to a firing camp in the Sinai Desert at a place called Asluj.
Sorry, what is a firing camp, Peter?
A firing camp's where they go and practice firing. Remember, most of the time they don't fire the guns, so they'd fire the guns at Reedsdale. We discussed that in the first podcast on the lads, but they hadn't fired them since.
Oh, right.
So they've done lots of gun drill, but it's what they call dry gun drill. And now this is wet gun drill. No, that's not what they call it. But it's wet. They're going to actually fire the gun. So they're doing everything that they have to do. Now, just getting there was training, because I mentioned driving in the desert, but do you know how to drive in a desert?
No.
It's like in England. Do English drivers know how to drive in snow? Not really. It's one of the reasons our roads stop, whereas in places like Russia and other cold places with snow, can't think of any of them. Scotland. No, I'm not upsetting the Scots. There's too many of them. Too many of them in London. They don't seem to live in Scotland. Anyway, you're Scottish, aren't you? Anyway, driver Harold Thompson driving, and this is really interesting. I don't drive, but I know you do. And he says you learned eventually to change gear without using your clutch for quickness. In M vehicles, in the olden days, he means, you double declutched. Instead of just putting your clutch in and going into gear, you had to put your clutch in, take it out of gear, put your clutch in again, and put it into your next gear. Without the clutch, you listen to your revs and then put it into gear. It's something you've got to learn how to do. You've got to know exactly when to do it. Otherwise, you've got to... Did you understand any of that? Because I don't.
Yes, because I used to drive a bus.
Oh, right.
So double declutch, I completely understand. And actually, when you move it into neutral, often you'd have to use the accelerator, get some revs before you could put it into gear. So I know exactly what he means.
And is he right?
Yeah, you get it wrong, and it's just crunch,
So when they get there, so that was good training in its sense, learning to drive in sand, how to get out of sand, using sand mats, that kind of stuff, what not to go into, what to do, learning all that. When they get out there, every type of shoot, different types of barrage, you've got how to camouflage your position in the desert, always a bit of a problem. With net desert coloured scrim, but I'm shaking my head. Waste of time, listeners, me shaking my head, isn't it? So they practice everything in active service conditions, and basically they're trying to show that they're ready for action. And
I believe temperatures are getting up as high as 95 degrees in the shade.
Very, very, very hot. I mean, it really is hot. I mean, there's no two ways about it.
So they're there. The guns have finally arrived. So, they're practicing, and
who assesses it?
Assesses it? So I believe there's somebody called Brigadier Keith Dunn.
Now, he is a character. He is the Commander Royal Artillery, CRA. That if we were intellectuals, we'd just say CRA.
Yeah.
But that doesn't help much. So I hate acronyms. Commander Royal Artillery.
Say CRA from now on.
Oh, of course you will, because you are a CRA.
Yeah.
If you understand that. He was Commander Royal Artillery of the 1st Cavalry Division, and he was. Now you've got to remember, South Notts Hussars are territorials. How do you think the regulars feel about territorials?
Yeah. So they would look. Not down on them, perhaps that's too strong, but they wouldn't view them as a very professional unit.
Yeah, that's it. They're looking to criticise, basically, because they're not them. It's a very human thing to do. I mean, I don't blame him. But, and he really had it in for them. And there's a quote from Lance Sergeant Ian Sinclair, who was in 425 Battalion. He said, Brigadier Dunn came and gave us the most god-awful roasting of all time. For the first time, I was afraid of a man. His steely blue eyes. We were sloppy. We didn't know our drill. We were no bloody good. There was nothing really wrong, but there was no way they were going to let you think you were God's gift. He didn't say that one troop or battery was better than any other. We were all bloody awful as far as he was concerned. No one ever forgot him, or forgave him for that matter, because we were trying so hard. I love it. And another great story about, it shows, to me, it just shows soldiers, and it's not, we've got a sad bit coming up. So I like, in a way, I like to look at this vision. And he had a row there was an officer called Colin Barber, one of the Barber family. He was a captain. Anyway, he'd had a row with Don, not a man to have a row with. And he'd ordered him to walk back to the Asludge camp. And he's sort of walking back in 96 degrees, with his kit. And every single vehicle in the South Notts Hussars who knew what had happened stopped to ask him if he wanted a lift. Would you like a lift, sir? I can't think of a word that's not swearing. Bugger off! And I just like the idea of this bloke trudging along, and up comes another gun tower. Would you like a lift, sir?
So timing-wise, presumably around this time you've got Dunkirk and what's happening in France.
Not quite. Yeah, it's just start. Yeah, May, late May. Of course, no, you're right. No, I'm wrong. Yeah, May. It's all kicks off on about the 10th.
Are they getting news from what's going on in
They're starting
France?
to get, but it's still a bit vague. I've just got a couple more things to say about Asludge, because there's a sad bit coming with the news of the one is that there's some Australians there. Now, as you know, our benefactor in this whole podcast series is the rather wonderful Matt McLachlan. Now, that's the first time I've ever pronounced his name right, and that's in tribute to the support he's given us, Gary, in this thing. Because normally I call him McLachlan as he spells it, but McLachlan. And here's a story about the Australians just for him. And this is from Gunner Ernie Harry. One night, Captain Fred Porter was taking guard mounting duty, and he was dressed in his blue dress uniform. Remember I said they got all their gear. He was walking down towards the parade ground when a group of Australians walked by. He turned round and said, "Hey, my man, don't you know to salute when you see an officer?" And he said, "Gord blimey, we thought you was one of the bloody band."
So these were Australians from London then?
Oh, piss off. Why can't you leave me alone with my poor accents? Anyway, it's at this time while they were at Asludge, something really sad happens, which, all the humour has to stop now, because this is the problem with war, isn't it? It's not all lads having, that's a battlefield tour. It's a good fun thing, or it's a sporting tour. Of course, you have to realise that when you go to war, it's not fun. And while they were at Asludge...
And I think I would add, actually, that even though you're training, there's still danger.
Of course. There are always accidents, there are diseases, and there are things that can go wrong. And when they go wrong, if you're at something like the Asludge firing camp, you're not near any doctors or hospital. Well, you're not near any hospital or competent doctors, as we'll find out. While they were there, Gunner Robert Paulson went down with appendicitis. And it wasn't diagnosed. There's two possibilities, and you'll hear in the South Notts Hussars, if you listen to them at the War Museum, you'll hear loads of people saying there's two reasons why it happened. I'll tell you the first one. This is Gunner Bob Folds. Now, Bob Folds was amazing. When I interviewed him, he must have been pushing 70, 68 or something. And I was about 50. And he looked younger than me, the bastard. Anyway, he was a wonderful bloke. And he said this. Bob Paulson was they called him Bob, of course, was a very nice lad. But he was a very obstinate boy. And he wouldn't go to the medical officer. Finally, we got the medical officer to see him. By that time, the pain had gone off. Now, that's life, isn't it? Now with doctor's appointments, you wait and you wait and wait. When you go, it's gone. And he was apparently perfectly okay. He said, "It's nothing, it's a bit of indigestion." And Dr. Finnegan, that's the doctor, the medical officer, rather took his word for it. We went out on a night occupation, taking up a position to fire. And Paulson was a signaller with me in this OP, observation post, occupied at night to fire at first line. Bob was in pain that night. It was obvious. And by the following morning, he was in agony. Now, this is getting serious now. Ray Ellis was another. I've got a lovely picture of the three of them together. And Ray Ellis, he didn't blame. He didn't. No talk about Paulson being obstinate. He just blamed Finnegan, and he really did. Now, this is not fair on Finnegan. You see, the thing is, that if you do personal experience, you get personal opinions, which are not necessarily based in fact. There may be prejudice. So I don't want, if there's a relative of Finnegan listening to it, I haven't got it down on Finnegan, but this is what Ellis thought. We'd go out on the range and come back and see poor old Bob there writhing in pain on the floor of this stinking little tent in the desert. He was in absolute agony. Sweat was pouring off him. But still, the doctor, that's Finnegan, wouldn't do anything about it until in the end, after 3 days, he had to realise that he was seriously ill. He was sent away to Jerusalem, but he had peritonitis, a burst appendix, and he died. And he was buried. He died on the 16th of May, 1940, just as the that's why it's a bit different when to take the war in Europe, because it's happening, and Bob Folds and Ray Ellis both went to the funeral because they were his particular friends. And Ray Ellis had a way with words, and he was in the back of this truck going the same journey as his friend in agony went. He said this: being one of his closest friends, I was sent as one of the burial party. We set off across the desert to follow the same track that poor old Bob had made on his last journey. It was an appalling journey. It was so bad, the bouncing in the back of this 1,500 weight truck, that I hit my head on the stanchions that held the canvas in place, and my nose was pouring with blood. I thought, poor old Bob coming along a thing like this with a burst appendix. I don't know whether you can imagine it. I mean, this is where the humour all stops suddenly, doesn't it? We saw the sister at the hospital who said she'd never known anyone fight so hard for his life. We buried him in Ramley Cemetery, and poor old Bob, it lies there to this day, and it's awful. It's just awful when you think about it. I don't know. We'll have to move on. He goes on to say he shouldn't have died of appendicitis. He should have been sent to hospital straight away. And then these hit home. It was an awful shock because he was so young. You don't expect 19-year-olds to die. A great loss, the first one, and the first one is always the worst. It really hit home in the regiment, and they all talked about it, whether they knew him or not. And this idea that 19-year-olds don't die. What do you think is the average age of the British soldier going into the army and dying on the battlefield?
Probably 19. 19
to 20.
Yeah.
So, in a way, this is just the very shadow of what's going to happen to so many of the lads. 18th of May, going back on to think, they go back to Hadera camp. And by now, I now get to your point. Sorry, I do apologise for
No. It's
and they're now hearing from about the Blitzkrieg, about the German advance in France, about and they're hearing about Stokers, and they're hearing about tanks, And Ted Whittaker, signaller Ted Whittaker, he was a signaller. He was a fantastic bloke. Seeing as we were armed with old 18-pounders, the most modern bit of which was the tyres. Cavalry. They were with cavalry units. And then we heard about the Blitzkrieg and the German Air Force. We were out in Palestine, and all this was happening in France. The war would be over and we'd be left out here. I know I began to wonder if I should ever get home again. They did not know what was happening. They thought that they might be left out there, that England might lose the war and they'd be out there. It was weird. And the other thing is they began to realise something else. How long the war was going to take, this.
And we touched on the sort of social aspects about them, worrying about who was at home and getting married, for example. So presumably they were looking from a distance, and there was a real worry that England could be invaded.
Absolutely, because that was a real. Well, you get academics will argue about whether, I'm not sure that it's entirely possible, But the point was...
A squaddy looking from a distance would be worried.
And this is Bombardier Charles Ward, and he said, there was a lot of discontent. Here we were out in Palestine where nothing was happening, doing meaningless drill when we knew all our people at home, mothers, wives and sweethearts, were at great risk. We thought they were going to be bombed to hell.
Yeah.
People were suffering in France and at home, and you felt rather guilty about it. You felt, why aren't we back there? And this was what's going on. They felt they were in a backwater. I'm not sure that was my phone. Remember I told you to switch our phones off. I'm not sure that they wanted to be in the war, but they felt slightly guilty and out of it. And that's just human nature, I suppose. And that's where we're pretty well at the end of their Palestine experience, because they are very soon after that, in early June, deployed to Egypt to face when the Italians came into the war. So that's where we leave it for today, I'm afraid.
All right, Peter, thank you very much. As always, it's very enlightening. I'm finding our series on the South Notts Hussars fascinating. I can't wait for the next one.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that apropos of nothing, because I hope people who are listening to this might think of buying the book that's coming out. A little. I mean, you weren't to know that I had a book out, but my book, At Close Range, an artillery regiment in 1930. All right, I'll shut up now. With profile books. All right, I'm shutting up now. Goodbye.
Subtle being your middle name. See you soon, Peter.
Bye.
Bye.